Hello, it's Andrew with today's Stop and Go. This one coming to us from a $100 freeze out on PokerStars. You're under the gun +1 with Ace Queen of Diamonds at the 100, 200 ante level. For those of you who don't know, Feraldo87 is an extremely good tournament player if that affects your, extremely good poker player in general if that affects your decision. What's your play and why with Ace Queen of Diamonds? I think this is a pretty clear raise, and given that stacks are shallow, especially the player in the big blind has a shallow stack, I don't think you want to raise too big here. I think minimum raising is an option, although it does give extremely good price to the player in the big blind to call. Some of you know how fond I am of peeling out of the big blind when you're getting a price like that, and Feraldo87 being an extremely good player is going to be able to take advantage of that as well. So I think that there's potentially a case for raising a bit larger. I don't think I would go to 600, but I think making it something like 475 or 500, even as little as 450, I think those are options worth considering as well. As it happens, we are called by several players. Don't know much about Vladislavius, Crime Rat 420, also an extremely good tournament player. I think that if Feraldo87 were to jam here, we'd be very happy to get it in with Ace Queen suited. I think with this much dead money in the pot, that would be a pretty good situation, far better for us actually than going to the flop 5 ways, but it is what it is. End up getting a reasonably favorable flop. Action checks the hero. What's your play now? I would say that betting can't be too bad. Obviously, we flopped an extremely strong hand. We can get action from worse. That said, I also think this is not a particularly vulnerable hand. We have the top pair with a top kicker, so an ace is not going to be a scary turn card. A diamond is not a scary turn card. There are some turns that are better than others, but there's also a decent chance that if we check, somebody else will stab at it. So checking is not necessarily going to the turn. It's not like if we check, we just automatically see a turn card. One of these players could very easily bet at the pot if we check. And I do think in general, this is not a situation where you get to continuation bet very often. When you raise and get called by 4 people and the flop looks like this, I think if you're holding ace king, if you're holding pocket 6s, pocket 8s, even pocket 10s or jacks for that matter, I think there are quite a few hands that I don't particularly want to bet on this flop. So I think that having some stronger hands that are in your checking range as well is not a bad idea. And I do think that betting here is going to look very strong and make it somewhat difficult for you to get action from worse. Many of the hands that give you action are going to be hands that you might actually have difficulty playing against on future streets. I mean, if you bet and get called and the turn is a king or an 8 or a 10 or a jack, those can all be potentially uncomfortable for you depending on who calls and how much money is behind. So I check here, which I think is a somewhat better play than betting actually. Ends up checking around and we get, I would say, a pretty nice turn card. Checks, Feraldo87 shoves, decision now. I don't think there's any reason why you should raise as opposed to just calling. You really don't have to fear. I mean, if someone has a 7, they have a 7. I don't think you're getting away from it one way or the other. I don't think you really have to fear giving anyone pot odds to come in. There are a few draws. For one thing, I think if somebody had a hand like 10-8 or Jack-10, there's a decent chance they would have bet on the flop with it. But even so, those hands are not drawing as many outs as they think because the diamonds is going to end up making them a dominated hand. So I don't think you're really trying to raise anybody off of anything. I think you might as well just call here. Doesn't make a huge difference, but I think it's slightly better than folding. As it happens, Feraldo87 has a dominated queen. I would say there's a decent chance with the stack to pot ratio being what it is that you would have gotten it in on the flop even if you had bet. But to be honest, I would not be absolutely shocked if he found a way to get away from it. As I said, I think betting into this many people on the flop is going to look awfully strong, and he is the caliber of player who might well be able to pick up on that and fold it. So I think this is something you have to take into consideration when you're playing against tougher players, is you really have to think in terms of your entire ranges and what sort of information you're giving away when you play a hand in a particular way. And in this case, I think it's worth considering just how wide you would bet this flop. Rather than just looking at a flop and saying, oh, this is a good flop for my hand, I'll bet. I think you should look at it and say, think about how that flop interacts with your range and say to yourself, is this a flop that I'm generally going to bet or generally check? And again, it's not just a question of the flop, but the whole situation, how many people are seeing the flop with you, what position you're in, what the stacks looks like, etc. And in this case, I would say this is a situation where you should not that often be betting the flop with I can think about a number of different hands in your range, and I listed many of them earlier that I think should check this flop, and I think this is a hand that pretty well belongs in the flop checking range. I'd be far more likely to bet the flop if I did not have the backdoor flush draw.